Good morning. I'm Rudy el-Khoury, Dean of the School of Architecture. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Smart Cities Miami Conference, jointly hosted by the School of Architecture and the Frost Institute for Data Science and Computing. This is the 8th edition of the conference, which was launched in 2017 with the aim of establishing the University of Miami as a hub for smart city research and a catalyst for partnerships across academia, industry, and government. Over the years, we've explored big data and design and how they're shaping the future of our cities, with a focus on real-world applications and interdisciplinary collaboration. This year opens a new chapter in our ongoing exploration. While the conference continues to spotlight emerging technology and design innovation, there's now a sharper emphasis on scholarly inquiry, on questioning assumptions, examining impacts, and engaging critically with the smart city paradigm. In past editions, the conference has drawn primarily on the wealth of local talent in our academic and professional communities, a strength that has made the conference a Miami-centered forum that is firmly rooted in the city's unique conditions and aspirations. This year, as we turn a page, we've cast a wider net and welcome speakers and contributors from other regions, broadening the conversation with diverse perspectives and new voices in the field. I want to express special thanks to those who have traveled here to join and enrich the discussion. I also want to thank the committed group that makes this conference possible year after year. Evelyn Cruz, Helen Janelle, Justin Gamage, Madison Brennan, and the rest of the team dedicated to putting all this together. Thank you one more time for the great work. Thank you. Finally, I'm delighted to introduce the new chair of the conference, Professor Sarbeswar Praharaj, who now opens a new chapter with the 2025 edition. Dr. Praharaj is an assistant professor at the University of Miami School of Architecture and the Department of Geography and Sustainable Development. He is also an affiliate faculty with the University of Miami Climate Resilience Institute. Dr. Praharaj is the director of the Master of Professional Science in Urban Sustainability and Resilience, an interdisciplinary program that aligns urban technology and design with sustainable climate resilience solutions. He has published over 30 journal articles, and his research has been recognized with funding from the National Science Foundation. In addition to all his leadership and scholarly activities, he has managed to brilliantly shape this year's program and will now guide us through the agenda. Sarb, over to you.
Good morning and welcome to the Smart Cities Miami Conference. I'm delighted to see that nearly 8-9 months of work is culminating into this wonderful lineup of speakers, attendees, guests who has all gathered here, and it's truly a privilege to see you all here. This year's conference is designed around equitable and smart urban futures and how we collectively explore data and design solutions to build future cities that are livable, that are resilient, and that address the complexities that we see increasingly in our cities. We have a fairly packed schedule through the day with initial keynote presentations, by Professor Jennifer Clark from Ohio State University and Nathalie Crutzen of the University of Liège, Belgium. So these are our star speakers, and I'm sure they will have enough for you to really think and deliberate on what smart cities are and what direction we see our cities should move. And then we have two thematic sessions that also has a couple of presentations in those sessions, as well as panel discussions. So the morning thematic session, Data and Urban Tech for Designing Equitable Smart Cities, features presentations by colleagues from MIT's Sensible City Lab and Cornell Tech. This will be followed by a panel discussion that will also include experts from the city of Coral Gables, the city where we all live and play, and also colleague from the Loyola University of Chicago. So thank you for being here, the speakers and panelists. In the afternoon, we have another thematic session which is titled Innovating Agile and Human Smart Cities. So, we explore data and tech in the morning, and then in the afternoon we also explore how do we become agile, smart, and resilient at the same time. So that also has a follow-up panel discussion, and that will have speakers from Harvard University, University of Florida, City of Pompano Beach, and University of Santa Catarina, Brazil. So you'll see that we have speakers who are coming from the academic spheres, who are representing the cities and city councils in the region, and we want to engage with the policymakers so much because that's the collaboration that will produce future smart cities. There will be an afternoon industry panel to further deepen our emphasis on engaging with the industry. So that will be powering smart cities through collaborative innovations with industry-specific challenges and opportunities for smart cities. That panel will have representations from NVIDIA, Dover, Cole and Partners, OnePrint, Street Plans, and Magma. So thank you for those industry leaders for being here and be able to participate in these discussions and enrich us with your insights on smart cities opportunities. Last but no means least, we have a closing keynote by Professor Martin de Jong and Nora Nouri from Erasmus University, Netherlands, who has flown so far from the Netherlands to be here. And so we should be staying till the end. This is some of the really interesting insights that are brought from by our European colleagues here. I'm deeply grateful for your participation, and I'm sure that you will actively engage and ask questions, network, making this event a catalyst for action. So thank you for being here and welcome. Now may I take the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker. The first keynote speaker is Professor Jennifer Clark. She is the Knowlton School Distinguished Professor and Head of City and Regional Planning at the Ohio State University. She is the Editor-in-Chief of Regional Studies and a Fellow of the American Association of Geographers, as well as the Regional Studies Association. Dr. Clark holds a PhD from Cornell University and has also taught at Cornell and Georgia Tech before moving to Ohio State. Professor Clark has authored several influential books, including the ones that lives on my shelf in my office here, that is Uneven Innovation, The Work of Smart Cities, which has won multiple awards. Her research publications have attracted nearly 4,000 citations, a testament to her leadership and impact in the field. Dr. Clark has consulted for the OECD, the US, UK, and Canadian governments, and has provided expert testimony before the US Congress. So there is no better leader to start the day than Professor Clark. Please take the stage, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? You good? Okay, great. So I get to be the guinea pig, making sure that all the technology works this morning. But what I really want to do is start with a thank you to the organizers here. The organization has just been just exemplary, and I really want to thank our hosts here at the university. So I wanted to start today by, see if it works, advancing the slides. Okay. So I wanted to start today by talking a little bit about not only what my area where I've spent a lot of time recently publishing in, which is really around smart cities, but I position smart cities within a larger context of what I call the Urban Technology Project, which is both backwards looking and forwards looking from the point of smart cities. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about how artificial intelligences are also coming into the smart cities conversation and into the Urban Technology Project. You'll notice as I go through this presentation that there are some images, which is unusual for someone who is in city and regional planning to have images, but I'm in an architecture school, so I'm kind of obligated to do it. But what I try to do with the images, and you'll enjoy some of them because they are local, they're actually my images too, is that I'm trying to emphasize a little bit through this talk the idea about specificity of place, right? And so that will be a theme that comes throughout. So within the Urban Technology Project, what we see is actually a longer story about technology diffusion into city and regional applications. It's not really anything new. For those of us who kind of remember learning about sort of the mid-century, mid-last century conversation about urban operating systems and how that's come back around, as soon as computers got big enough to actually do the processing, we started to talk about things about what they could do to help us with transportation, modeling, what they could do with waste management, and then sort of the promise of how all of that could be integrated together and become sort of an automated urban operating system. Smart cities emerges within that conversation, and sort of reimagines that conversation within the 21st century context, and because of things like Internet of Things, because of the advent of things like big data. And now what we're adding to that is the conversation around large language models and different kinds of artificial intelligences. So one of the things that always got me really interested in the Smart Cities project was less the question of smart, because I've studied technology diffusion both in the private sector and the public sector, so it wasn't so much the question of technology diffusion that was interesting to me. It was really the question of why the city. Because the tech sector tends to be essentially not that interested in geography. And what was interesting to me about this was that there was a very big emphasis on using the city as the preferred scale for prototyping and deploying the technologies that were being developed. So one of the things that I thought was so interesting was what the city really gave to the tech sector as it was actually developing a whole set of production, distribution, consumption, and products and services and systems, right? So the metaphors here are really interesting. The city's a sandbox for developing technologies and developing a customer base, right? You can think about what happened in Toronto as a very good example of that. You also have to think about this as the idea that it's a regulatory and administrative space where you can actually extract data in a pretty specific way. This is the metaphor around data, that it's about oil. And then obviously there's a piece about the subsidy and risk reduction that comes with partnerships between the public and private sector. That's the industrial state sort of model. So what ends up happening here is we see the Urban Technology Project is really about platform building and market making in cities. And so in order to think about that, we think about that the way we would think about the deployment of any set of technologies or any industry between the sort of design phase and then the prototyping and the actual sort of mature product phase. And so that's the way I looked at smart cities, and I think that it's been a useful way to analyze the industry over time. So you can see cities, if you think about cities as platforms, you think about how this integrates into real estate development. Some of you all will be familiar with Chelsea Market, Ponce City Market, all of these places where there's a lot of data collection, a lot of point of sale data collection, a lot of also deployment of sort of prototyping smart cities objects as well. And these are within private spaces where you can integrate multiple pieces of that deployment project. And in both cases, they're connected to infrastructure projects that are more of the light infrastructure projects that we see within urban planning, things like the High Line, things like the Belt Line. So you can see how this sort of changes how we're thinking about integrating infrastructure and thinking about real estate development at the same time. Now, what's happened in the more recent period is we're actually, and this is even true in the last couple of months, we're starting to see two implementation paths, especially around the next stage for smart cities and how artificial intelligence will be involved. We're seeing two paths really emerge. One is that specified, very localized, cities level participation and partnership between cities and the firms involved. And then the other path is the federal government scale. And this is not exactly new. The federal government has been involved in thinking about smart cities for some time. In fact, the Office of Science and Technology Policy under the Obama administration started the Metro Lab network. So it's not that there hasn't been any conversation about this before, but now what we're seeing is some very specific conversation going on. So the question is it a city path or is it going to be a federal government path, a bottom up or a top down? So when we go back to think about the way I had written about smart cities a few years ago, one of the things that I thought was really a key was to keep track of sort of 5 key components. I call them 5 premises around a smart city development. One is that uneven innovation is both where we have been and where we are going. And that is the idea that it is unevenly distributed how these technologies are rolled out. So if they are indeed part of creating a platform for economic development, what that means is you're going to get uneven levels of economic development. This is not new. We see this already, but this is, unless there was some intentionality around the even distribution of smart cities technologies, there's likely to be an uneven distribution of it. The other piece is that I mentioned before, that the tech sector is actually looking at the city as a source of subsidy and risk reduction. And that means in how it develops products, right? So the tech sector is actually exploiting uneven innovation as well as it is maintaining it. And that has to do with some traditional issues within city and regional planning around interjurisdictional competition. Another piece to keep in mind is that the Smart Cities project more broadly was rolled out in a sort of fast policy way. For those of you who study policy diffusion, what that basically means is one city sees that the Lyft scooters are being deployed, and they say, aha, we're going to deploy Lyft scooters here so nobody thinks that we aren't hip and aren't on top of it. It doesn't go through a long, deliberative public administration, a process of evaluating the relative pros and cons. It's not a cost-benefit analysis, it's a deployment, right? And that kind of policy diffusion circumvents other traditional methods of policy transfer and generally circumvents any effort at actual looking at opportunity costs. The other piece of this is how it relates to work. How does smart cities, how does urban technology actually relate to work? And indeed, what we can see at the time that I wrote this, I was thinking more about co-working. I was not thinking about having the COVID shift everything to work from home, but that just amplified this idea that the technology in the city is a platform for labor flexibility. And then finally, I think this is a very important point, and this continues to be clearly the case, which is the data are the product, but nobody really knows what the revenue model looks like. People are absorbing the technology, but they don't actually know what its value is. So this gives us a set of choices and pathways. One of those choices is the question of national versus local implementation, meaning Is there going to be specificity, or are the models going to be designed from a generalizable level? There's also this question of upskilling versus deskilling. Using the new tools, this was the case with smart cities applications, definitely the case with artificial intelligence applications. There's some conversation that this is going to make, remove jobs, but actually in the public sector for urban governance, it's probably going to be a big upskilling challenge, right, to figure out how to use these tools properly. There's also a question of whether the sandbox where we develop these tools and techniques are actually places or whether they're sectors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The question of opportunity costs I raised, and then who pays, whether this is a public sector or a private sector in a project, and then the question of ownership, and that's both data and platform. So one of the things that happened with the Smart Cities project is it became a big shift in the revenue model around the first Trump administration, when it became clear that infrastructure investment was not going to happen at the scale that had been anticipated at the beginning of developing the federal and the city partnership. So what you saw cities do is do a much lighter sort of implementations, wayfindings, EV charging stations, scooters, that sort of thing. So as this whole thing progresses, as it becomes clear where the investment is going to come from, you see these changes in the revenue model. So what are we seeing now? One of the things that we're seeing now are that we're starting to categorize the diffusion of urban AI into different ways of understanding what's actually happening. So we see the use cases developing around robots and drones, right? And this tends to be around delivery and security applications. Within urban governance, we're starting to see urban operating systems for services and administration, not so much for regulation, but some for regulation. In terms of software, we're seeing this emphasis on platform software. And if you think about this, almost all of this is sort of interactive. So you can see where the the language models are really contributing to this. So digital assistance, healthcare, mental health, and then you've got the really interesting one that's real estate and real estate pricing. And then on transportation, we still hear this conversation going on about autonomous vehicles. So there are some speculations about applications of generative AI for governance. This is a report. There are a couple of reports that have come out from UN Habitat about assessments of what responsible AI would look like from at the urban scale. And really what they're talking about is the idea that the search function, when you try to find out information, when you start a project, when you start to write something, do you go to the Google search bar or do you go to the ChatGPT search bar? And so what you're seeing is two different directions. Google's trying to actually maintain its dominance by creating the AI behind that, and then you see competitors who are coming into that space. So the idea really is, how does the query platform work? Does the public sector need to have a query platform itself for its own services, for its own citizens? The second report from UN Habitat goes through in some detail applications. And this is really interesting to me because one of the challenges always here is developing the use cases for these technologies. The applications here you can see are really by domain, right? Energy, mobility, public safety, these are all the domains within urban governance. And that's how they're thinking about what the usefulness and the use cases will be, how they will be developed. But they also caution us about the limits of AI in this context. First, that the systems themselves reinforced assumptions in their data and design. Second, they cannot evaluate their own performance. This one is key because what this one actually means is that the upskilling is a non-trivial question, right? People have to be able to assess what is produced by the AI. And the systems themselves are mathematical and they're not nuanced. They don't integrate nuance. Again, all of this really matters if we are talking about the local context and the specificity of any particular place at any particular time in any particular community, right? So again, the emphasis here is looking at what is the tailoring of these tools and does local specificity matter in their design in addition to their implementation. So just like with smart cities, we start to see the private sector get in this game, right? The consulting firms are rolling out here. And so this is how we know that there is actually a value proposition that has been identified. And we can see this start to happen. We also see cities being pushed to take a regulatory position. And this is happening in response to situations in real time. So some of you will be familiar with the fires in LA that happened around December-ish. And landlords were using AI to actually set new rents and real estate prices. And this, of course, pushes the cities to think, well, wait a second, do we have a role in regulating this? Or not, and how would we do that, right? So again, specialization within the local agencies to understand what's going on. And then, you know, as we sit here and define the use cases for generative AI, one of the things to keep in mind is the way folks have been talking about what these are really good for. And I really like this terminology, and this comes from the Technology Services Group in GSA in its previous iteration, which is thinking about the AI as generically useful foundation models for text information tasks, which is, you know, a very specific way of thinking about it, but gets you a sense of, you're talking about discrete uses, identifying text images or text and images, or integrating those things into summaries or analyses, and then they're sort of anticipating the idea that there could be decision making that comes from it, right? And so where are the industries where we would see these use cases roll out? You can see this list of industries here. You can think of use cases that have been sort of touted in all of these cases. Coming from a university, running an academic department, I can speak quite a bit about the teaching and learning a rollout. And I think about MOOCs. I think about other times when large models were rolled out in education. And we see a fair amount of experimentation going on there. The question is, where do you see all of these industries all aggregated in one place where you could actually work on these use cases? And the answer is the federal government. So we get back to this question of why it's important that the federal government is actually so interesting for the purposes of artificial intelligence and what that means for the rest of us. So since being able to test use cases across all of those industries that exist in the private sector, I'll tell a little bit of the story of the GSA sandbox, the AI sandbox within the General Services Administration. So many of you will remember that in 2013, there was a very glitchy rollout of something called healthcare.gov. Healthcare.gov was a moment when the federal government thought to itself, maybe we should be able to write software in-house. This could be something we need to learn how to do. So what ended up happening is that the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is sort of in the White House side of the executive branch, started to think about how do we pull together the folks at Census, the folks who are within NOAA, the folks in the different agencies that did have big data capability, did know spatial analysis, that did know all of these different platforms and the interfaces of platforms, how to pull them together and put them into sort of a group that went around solving problems around the federal government. And they landed this group within the General Services and Administration ultimately. And that group's job was to link things like data science and artificial intelligences and think about how it actually worked for the purposes of providing services and developing new products, and to some extent to think about it from a regulatory perspective. This group is now called GSAI. I just flagged that for you in case you want to keep looking to see what they do. And that group actually did a fair amount of work about launching these tools in a way that within a sandbox environment, meaning with boundaries. So they launched these tools not just generically, but in a very constrained way, and partnering with individual agencies to figure out, how this all was actually rolling out. And in this way, they started to develop new ways of thinking about how AI could actually be useful in the context of urban governance and service providing. Again, not connected specifically to cities, but ultimately backstopping the functions of cities and being a partner with cities, much like the Metro Lab network had been. So the primary use cases for the AI digital platforms that have really rolled out that are relevant to cities in these contexts are things like predictability, right? So policing, things around making profits around real estate and rental markets, also things around replicability, right? Digital twins, urban design, you've heard some of these. I did Little Island here as a design example of the replicability question, because many of the urban design projects in New York City end up getting deployed more broadly. But again, what we see from people who are thinking deeply about the question of AI in cities is that there's this deep need to start from the local context, that in the process of designing the models and feeding information into the models, it really needs to be deeply localized. That's difficult for the tech sector because the more local it is, the less large the market is, right? So there's this tension between a broadly generalist approach and a highly tailored approach. And this was actually a chapter I wrote at the end of Uneven Innovation, which was called The Local is the Enemy, but I really meant the local is not the enemy, because I actually at one point doing research for this book was sitting next to somebody who was a developer for the tech sector who literally said to me, the local is the enemy. Meaning like that is not helpful because it so constrains the market, right? And that is just antithetical to how we think about doing urban planning, placemaking, windward walls, all of those things that make particular cities very specific and particular kinds of places. So we think about the work having the two pathways that I mentioned. The work in AI has the option of upskilling, where we're embedding advanced technologies in incumbent occupations. This kind of sounds not that bad, right? It would be good to do our work better. I don't know about you, but I am still not good at Microsoft Teams, so I'm upskilling on this stuff. And I think about, it in that context. The de-skilling pathway is the idea that AI would substitute for low-skilled labor, and that's a little harder to see exactly how that would actually work without a much longer timeline to do it. And the data remains a problem. And one of the things that those of you who are really deep into smart cities, the problem partly was that the data's not great. Data is incomplete, especially at the local level. There's not a lot of people who've been hired in to actually do the data work. There's not a lot of deep knowledge about the data. There's not even a recognition that data work is work. So this whole piece of, hey, we're trying to build an entire new platform of artificial intelligence across a weak data platform, that continues to be a non-trivial part of this story. So the federal agency pathway is something that has now emerged. The federal agency pathway is the one that has the office that within GSA has now been restructured, and the tools that they were using within a delimited sandbox are now being widely distributed, not just throughout the General Services Administration, but throughout the rest of the federal government in an effort to sort of get the prototype going to scale and get past the beta phase as fast as possible. So this leads to a really interesting question about what cities are going to do in that context. So one question here is, how are we miscalculating risk when we get outside the sandbox and do the mass deployments? One of the really interesting things about the technology transformation services, which is kind of colloquially called 10X within the federal government, doesn't exist anymore, but if you know how to use the Wayback Machine, you'll be fine finding these things. But they were actually using the same approaches to doing research that we use in the university, meaning institutional review board evaluations about the question of human subjects usage, all of those sorts of things. Some of this feels like bureaucracy. Some of it feels like actually doing a good job of doing research, right? So there becomes this question of how we get to the right AI and how we deal with the lagging normative context. So AI doesn't know what is preferred. This is something to keep in mind. It doesn't know what's better unless we tell it. So keeping that in mind is helpful as we use it. It cannot actually anticipate needs. The learning that it has is either present or past. It is not future. One of the things that is very interesting to me about that is, as somebody who's an urban planner, one of the things urban planners do is they think about the future. They think about how things can be different and better. That's a big challenge. And obviously, it cannot do the systematic evaluation. So there's a consensus about this, the question of bias here. We know this from an empirical standpoint, and that leads us to the question of what's actually next for cities and AI. I use the MIT Technology Review cover here because about every 2 years, MIT Technology Review does another smart cities, trying to, where are we next, where are we next? And so where are we next? And I think the thing to keep in mind is that the federal government, under current conditions, is not going to be a reliable technology funding or regulatory partner for cities as they do this. Cities are going to have to do these deployments on their own, using their own expertise, and will have to work on this without the hope of having a partner. So in some ways, that's very similar to what we've been doing. We did that with the smart cities technologies largely, and we could do that again. And again, we need to think about the data and solve that problem. And on that wonderfully optimistic note, I will end my remarks. Thank you so much.